Good evening. I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, January 31st. We begin the newscast tonight with the latest GDP reading from Statistics Canada. The agency reports the economy grew by 0.1% in November as higher interest rates began to slow spending. It's estimating that the economy stayed flat in December and that the economy grew at an annualized rate of 1.6% in the fourth quarter, which would be down from 2.9% in the third. November's economic growth was driven by the public sector, transportation and warehousing, as well as finance and insurance. Moving to British Columbia now, which is introducing a policy of decriminalization as part of what it says is an overall plan to prevent overdose deaths from illicit drugs. Drug users will be allowed to carry up to a total of 2.5 grams of opioids, such as heroin and fentanyl, as well as cocaine, methamphetamine, and MDMA. The province says it aims to reduce the stigma around drug use so people can reach out for help to get services. The crisis has claimed over 11,000 lives since a public health emergency was declared in April 2016. The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples is commenting on the police beating death of Tyree Nichols in Memphis. It says this is a reminder of systemic police brutality in both the U.S. and Canada. It is urging Canadian police forces to make fundamental changes to end brutality against members of racialized groups and for police officers to learn how to de-escalate tense situations. National Chief Elmer St. Pierre says racism and discrimination are the roots of police brutality against racialized people. Emergency healthcare services in Atlantic Canada were dealt another blow this morning. There were problems with the 911 system in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. The disruption was brief in PEI, and service has now been restored in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick as well. It's not clear what caused the outages. All right, switching gears to recent recommendations by the nonprofit Health Standards Organization. It says residents of long-term care homes should get at least 4 hours of direct care a day. This updated guidance also recommends paying long-term care home employees on par with other healthcare workers. The organization's panel of experts say the standards will only be useful if the federal government enforces them. From long-term care to child welfare, Peguis First Nation has become the first Indigenous group in Manitoba to take control of child welfare. This is under 3-year-old federal legislation. The First Nation north of Winnipeg is one of just over 24 communities to have notified Indigenous Services Canada that it intends to handle its own child and family services. Saskatchewan's Cowessess First Nation was the first group in Canada to take over child welfare in 2021. Turning to a new report which says Ontario job seekers are increasingly looking for work in other provinces. And the finding is especially true for those seeking jobs in remote-friendly sectors like tech and marketing. The job search company Indeed says the second half of 2022 saw 6.1% of clicks on Canadian job postings by Ontario-based job seekers were for positions in other provinces. Now, that's an almost 50% increase from the second half of 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic upended the labor market. In the nation's capital, the House of Commons has called on the federal government to list Russia-based mercenary company Wagner Group as a terrorist entity. New Democrat MP Heather McPherson's motion won unanimous consent from MPs to urge the Prime Minister's cabinet to make the designation in response to reported human rights abuses. All right, well, meanwhile, Canada's Financial Intelligence Agency has published a new operational alert. It's aimed at fighting the $20 billion a year international illicit wildlife trade. It is encouraging banks to watch out for business dealings that could involve the illegal trafficking of animals and exotic plants. FinTrack's alert says Canadian bears are poached for their bile, claws, and paws, and that criminals are targeting several species at risk, including cougars, lynx, narwhals, turtles, and wolves. Over to the Canadian music industry now. The Weeknd is back atop the nominees at this year's Juno Awards. The Toronto-raised pop singer earned 6 nods across some of the main categories. It's a repeat performance for the hitmaker, whose most recently was the top Juno nominee 2 years ago. Other big contenders at Canada's biggest music award show include Calgary's Tate McRae, who is tied with Napanee, Ontario native Avril Lavigne with 5 nominations. The Juno Awards broadcast will air on CBC TV and CBC Gem from Edmonton on March 13th. All right, Forum Daily will be right back after the break. And when we return, we're going to be taking a deeper look at drug decriminalization in BC. Stay with us. British Columbia's move today to decriminalize possession of certain drugs is getting mixed reactions from experts and advocates. Drug users will be allowed to carry up to 2.5 grams of opioids, such as heroin and fentanyl, as well as crack and powdered cocaine, methamphetamine, and MDMA. A 3-year pilot project in BC means users will not be arrested or have their drugs seized by police. Federal Mental Health and Addictions Minister Carolyn Bennett says the plan is to move people away from the criminal justice system and toward health and social services. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into these developments is Dr. Lindsey Richardson with the BC Centre on Substance Use. She's also an associate professor at UBC. Dr. Richardson, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So what do we know so far about the science behind this decision?
Well, we've long understood that the criminalization of people who use drugs has significant negative impacts, and it does very little to discourage drug use or decrease the illicit drug supply. And so decriminalization is really seeking to reduce negative interactions with police and the harm from incarceration, for example, including physical and mental health. It's aimed to reduce stigma and the consequences of stigma, as well as longer-term impacts on things like employment or housing status or family stability.
I guess the big question here would be whether decriminalization is enough to tackle the opioid crisis and overdoses in the province.
I think it's really important to remember that decriminalization does nothing to address the toxic drug supply, which is the primary cause of the overdose crisis. And so decriminalization might not do much to reduce the risk of overdose at all. And so it's also important to remember that the change has serious limitations. So that threshold of 2.5 grams is too low to effectively decriminalize a lot of people who use drugs. And that includes people who are, for example, most commonly targeted by current enforcement efforts. And these are all things that put people at increased risk of overdose. I think another piece to remember is that it doesn't cover all substances. And so the opioid supply in Vancouver and in British Columbia right now is adulterated with fentanyl and benzodiazepines. And while fentanyl is covered, benzodiazepines aren't. And so there's a lot of question of some of the things that are key drivers of the overdose and opioid epidemic that we're currently in aren't necessarily going to be addressed by decriminalization.
It's clear that a lot more needs to be done here, Dr. Richardson. So what types of supports are needed along with decriminalization for this to successfully reduce overdoses in BC?
Well, I think it's important to remember that there's no single change or intervention that is going to be the thing that solves the overdose crisis. It really requires a lot of movement in a bunch of different areas. But I think probably the most important thing is the creation of a safe and regulated, accessible drug supply to really address the fact that the drug supply is toxic. And alongside that, we need to address the social and economic drivers of drug-related harm and really develop a comprehensive, accessible, and culturally appropriate system of treatment, harm reduction, and social care.
All right, Dr. Richardson, what about supervised consumption sites? How are they impacting the opioid crisis, and what is missing when it comes to them in particular?
Well, supervised consumption facilities are critically important for providing a safer environment for people to use drugs, so that if they do overdose, someone can be there to address that overdose, revive them with naloxone or oxygen. But supervised consumption facilities are really limited in that not everyone has access to them, particularly in rural and remote locations, and that they are really a response to rather than the prevention of overdose. And so we really need to be thinking about ways of preventing overdose to begin with.
All right, Dr. Richardson, just a quick minute left here, but for some further perspective, we know a lot of advocates are pointing to something called a mental health crisis, according to some advocates in our country. So, how closely is the mental health situation in Canada linked to overdoses and the opioid crisis?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really complex question. And a recent study by my team really identified that they are linked, that there is a linkage between mental disorders and non fatal and fatal overdose. But again, what's important to remember is that overdose and drug use and mental disorders often have common causes, common triggers. Things like economic disadvantage, colonization, racism, isolation, disconnection, chronic pain. And so we really need to be thinking about potentially common causes of both of those things.
Lots of important points to consider. Dr. Richardson, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. And of course, we're going to be taking a look at more news from around the world after that. So stay tuned. Forum Daily will return shortly. Around the world, individuals, groups, and governments are trying to switch from electricity produced from burning fossil fuels to cleaner wind and solar power. But some people have worried that there aren't enough rare earth minerals on the planet to make the green energy switch. But a new study published last week finds that the planet has enough of the 17 different types of materials needed, but will have to ramp up mining. Scientists say that it would add a bit to pollution, but this would be offset by savings in getting rid of dirty power plants. The study was published in the scientific journal Jewel. Well, with us now to discuss the study is Dr. Seaver Wang, co-director of the Climate and Energy team at the Breakthrough Institute. He's also one of the authors of the report. Dr. Wang, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So we've been hearing a lot about rare earth minerals recently, but what exactly are they and how do they help in producing clean energy, Dr. Wang?
Rare earth elements are very useful for their magnetic properties. They're used in wind turbine motors and in electric vehicle motors. They help allow for bigger wind turbines and electric vehicles and turbines that need less maintenance and are more efficient. They're also used in a lot of other important technologies like radar equipment, medical devices, drones, aerospace, and defense.
Sounds like some very important minerals there, Dr. Wang. Now, the study notes that while there are enough minerals, more mining will need to be done. So what are the impacts that this could have on the environment overall?
Yes, our study projected that extraction of rare earth elements might need to increase by 3 to 4 times over the course of the next few decades in order to support the amount of demand that society would need, even just for wind turbines alone. Now, mining does disrupt the land. You have to excavate. It can pollute the water. It can cause local air pollution from diesel particulates and from dust. If you don't manage the earth that's dug out of the mine properly, it can cause landslides. However, there are technical means to reduce these impacts and control them, and there are regulatory standards to govern them. Also, once a mine is fully mined, you can put the earth back in and conduct remediation to slowly, over time, restore the site to more of its former ecosystem functions.
So what does a successful mining operation that takes into consideration all these stipulations, what would that look like in Canada?
So Canada does already have sort of world-leading industry standards when it comes to mining, but there's always room for improvement. As technology improves, regulations should become more stringent to sort of ensure that mines are always working at the cutting edge and reducing impacts as much as possible. I also would draw attention to social risks. I think good social frameworks are very important. It's always very important for mine projects to have community input and consent, and for policymakers to require that as part of a mine permitting process. It's important for that mine projects provide good community social benefits, and that there's always sort of third-party inspection and regulation to ensure that they're abiding by good labor standards, good environmental standards, and that in general, these materials are needed, but we can get them the right way.
Lots of things to consider here. Now, for some further perspective, just how much of an impact would an increase in rare earth mineral mining have on the global energy sector, especially when it comes to this shift to cleaner energy?
That's a very good question. I think it's very important for the shift to clean energy because if there's a bottleneck in these essential minerals that go into clean energy technologies, it could end up making these alternative energy sources and electric vehicles more expensive. However, if we manage the increase in production of these important materials well, then it could actually make these technologies cheaper, faster, and accelerate adoption.
All right, Dr. Wang. Now, something we noticed is that the study does not look into minerals like lithium that are used for batteries or cars. Why was that?
Yes, so battery technologies are changing very quickly. The prevailing chemistries are changing rapidly. And so the amount of materials that you need to put into a battery is changing over time. Generally, it's improving over time. And this is a field that is moving so fast that we were uncomfortable about making assumptions with today's technologies to predict future needs a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades from now. So we ended up excluding batteries from that portion of the study. It's an important question, but one we'll have to keep an eye on as the technology evolves.
All right, Dr. Wang, a quick 30 seconds left here, but as one of the authors of this study, what would you say would be a main takeaway for policymakers and individuals?
Yeah, I think a very important thing from this study is that it's clear that we will need to expand production, but it's also clear that we will need to responsibly balance this with environmental and social goals. So finding good sort of pragmatic policies that on the one hand allow us to ramp up at the rate at which we can produce these goods, which will ultimately be better for the environment in terms of fighting climate change, while also ensuring that we don't harm communities that are nearby.
Pakistani authorities are trying to determine how a suicide bomber carried out one of the country's deadliest militant attacks in years. The bomber unleashed an explosion yesterday in a crowded mosque inside a highly secured police compound in the city of Peshawar. 100 people were killed and over 200 were wounded. Most of the victims were police officers, and officials say the bombing reflects security lapses. Well, as the conflict in Ukraine continues, the country has won the support from Baltic nations and Poland for its weeks-long quest to obtain Western fighter jets. Now, that ambition follows pledges by some larger countries last week to send Kyiv sophisticated modern tanks. Poland, Slovakia, and the Baltic countries on NATO's eastern flank feel especially threatened by Russia. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is calling for stronger ties with Japan. This comes as Russia's war on Ukraine has made the world a more dangerous and unpredictable place. Speaking in Japan as part of his Asia tour, Mr. Stoltenberg said believers of democracy and freedom need stronger partnerships. Japan has been quick to join the U.S.-led economic sanctions against Russia's war on Ukraine, and it has provided humanitarian aid and non-combative defense equipment for the Ukrainians. In another major international visit, Pope Francis has arrived in Kinshasa to start a 6-day trip to Congo and South Sudan. Aid workers hope that it would shine a spotlight on some of the world's forgotten conflicts. The trip would also bring the Pope face to face with the future of the Catholic Church. Africa is one of the only places in the world where the church is growing. Moving to the Caribbean now, where chaos continues in Haiti. Armed men have filled the power vacuum left by Haiti's crumbling government. This comes at a time when democracy has withered in the country and gang violence has spiraled out of control. The UN estimated in December that gangs controlled 60% of Haiti's capital. But nowadays, most on the streets of Port-au-Prince say that number is closer to 100%. While gangs profit from the chaos, at least 155,000 people have been forced to flee the violence. Switching to a new report which finds that Denmark is rated the least corrupt country on the planet. Now, this comes in Transparency International's 2022 Corruption Perceptions Index. The anti-graft organization's latest report finds 95% of countries have made little to no progress in fighting corruption since 2017. The index measures the perception of public sector corruption according to experts and business people. Canada held steady at number 14 on the list of 180 countries. All right, well, in economic news, the European Union Statistics Agency reports that Europe's economy scraped out a meager gain of 0.1% in the fourth quarter of last year. Eurostat says galloping inflation, fed by high energy prices and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, deterred people from spending in shops and restaurants. Turning to labor protests in France, as French labor leaders managed to bring 1.27 million people into the streets again. Now, that figure exceeds the 1 million people that took part in a first round of protests on January 19th. This comes in the latest clash of wills with the government over plans to push back France's retirement age. French President Emmanuel Macron's government says it is determined to push through this election pledge to reform France's retirement system. A first round of strikes and protests brought out between 1 million and 2 million demonstrators earlier this month. In a setback for conservation efforts, rhino poaching in Namibia increased dramatically last year. The country's environment ministry says nearly twice as many of the critically endangered animals were killed than the year before. The figures released on Monday show that 87 rhinos were poached in Namibia in 2022. Now, that is up from 45 in 2021. It added that 61 of the rhinos poached last year were black rhinos and 26 were white rhinos. The ministry says it is a serious concern. And back at home, a young black woman sold into slavery whose actions led to the gradual abolition of slavery in Upper Canada is being honored by the Canada Post. In March 1793, Chloe Cooley was kidnapped by a man in Queenston. He forced her on a boat across the Niagara River to the U.S. and sold her as a slave. Witnesses who heard her screams for help told her story to Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, and he used the testimony about Miss Cooley's attack to introduce new legislation. And in July 1793, the act to limit slavery in Upper Canada was passed. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.